Sorry, I have to speak in English, but you have a very good translator, so I'd like to thank Tatiana Slobodin for inviting me to the Ukraine. I've been to Lviv before, but this is my first visit to Kiev, so I hope to see some of the city while I'm here too. Now, as well as Tatiana inviting me, I have to also thank the Movement Disorders Society and give a little bit of publicity about the Movement Disorders Society, because I am the official ambassador for the Movement Disorders Society at this meeting. So it seems a long time ago, Stanley Farn, myself, Joe Jankovic, and David Marsden founded this society in the 1980s, and it's grown very successfully as a learned society with certain... Can I change this? Yeah, I can. Oh, yeah, let me... Yeah. So these are some of the aims of the society. So it's designed to spread knowledge about movement disorders, promote research into causes, prevention and treatment of movement disorders, and also to help give expertise, advice, and guidance to regulatory agencies, the public and patient support groups, and even government. So although it's not a political organization and it's got no authority, it's had quite a lot of influence in many countries in helping to promote and help patients with movement disorders. Oh. Yeah, I got it now. So, of course, many societies cost you money to join, and there are a lot of different societies that you can join, and not all of you will be particularly interested in movement disorders. So I don't expect you all to join, but for those of you, you might be particularly interested in, for countries like Ukraine, which the Americans class as a low-income country. I don't know if that's really true, but it means the good news for you all is that might mean that you don't have to pay any fee. So you could actually become a member without necessarily having to pay anything. If you're very rich, you can become a regular member, and it costs $300. And for young students and even for residents, there is no fee. So I would encourage particularly, the juniors to join up. Now, what does joining up give you? Well, it gives you access to the publications of the Movement Disorders Society. There are 2 journals now. Probably those of you who are interested in movement disorders already know this. There's the Movement Disorders Journal, which I was the editor of with Tony Lang a few years ago, but now there is also a second journal called Movement Disorders Clinical Practice, which focuses much more on clinical cases and clinical practice. So there are 2 separate journals. There's a vibrant website. You can submit videos, you can get opinions, and it's interesting. And you can get discounts to the international and regional congresses, and you can vote at the meetings. So those are the sort of things that you get from the Movement Disorders Society. And it's, as I've already mentioned, it's grown very quickly, so that there are now 7,000 members. Most of the members are doctors, physicians, but there are also some physical therapists, some nurse specialists, and medical students as well. So although it's mainly doctors, it's not exclusively doctors. So I know very little about the history of Ukrainian neurology. I know that some of your doctors are very good writers, and some of you have been very kind to buy my little book about my memoirs, really. But so the combination of writer and doctor is not unfamiliar to anybody from Ukraine. When I was in Estonia giving this PUSEP lecture 5 years ago, I learned that Ludwig PUSEP was born in Kiev. And what interested me particularly was that he came from a family of shoemakers. And my hero in British neurology is William Richard Gowers. And Gowers' father was also a shoemaker, so they were both shoemakers. And PUSEP, when he was in Tartu in Estonia, always called himself a neurologist who operates. And I think, of course, this is an enlightened view about, and many of the best neurosurgeons are really very, very good neurologists. So PUSEP considered himself a neurologist, but he had to spend a lot of his time doing surgical procedures. And he trained with Bekhterev and wrote his dissertation on neurosexology, which must have been very advanced for the time when he wrote it in 1902. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is Parkinson's essay. James Parkinson wrote his essay in 1817, but it was published in May 1817, so we're still in the bicentenary year of James Parkinson, even though we're, of course, into 2018. And rather than just give you a historical lecture about what James Parkinson said, what I'd like to try to do is to explain to you why I think it's very relevant and important to read his essay on the shaking palsy and some of the things that you can learn from reading it. Now, maybe I'm peculiar and maybe none of you are really quite like me, but I'm the sort of doctor who likes to read original descriptions. So when I started my residency in neurology, I wasn't very interested in textbooks of neurology. I didn't learn much from textbooks of neurology. Of course, I learned most from my patients at the bedside. That's where you really learn neurology, and it takes a long time. It takes many years. It takes almost as long as to become a Greek Vestal Virgin. So you have to study and see many patients over many years if you want to become a good doctor. But in addition to that, I always like to read the original descriptions. So Thomas Willis's description of myasthenia, Charcot's description of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Alois Alzheimer's description of presenile dementia, and James Parkinson's essay. And those of you who have read 19th century literature will know that it's medical literature. It often reads like a novel. So, you know, it's almost like, when you read these medical descriptions, it's almost like reading Bulgakov's novel or Tolstoy novel. The descriptions, at least for me, came to life. And of course, if something comes to life, you remember it. So if it doesn't come to life, then you'll forget it immediately. So this is perhaps the first reason why I think James Parkinson's essay is important. Now, this slide shows a London street in 1817. So you can see London was already a very busy city at that time. It's full of carriages and full of people. But there are not many women on the street. And that's a very interesting thing, because those of you who have read James Parkinson's essay will know that all the patients he described were men. And one of the reasons for that may be that most of the patients he described, he didn't see in his office, he saw when he was walking around the street. And perhaps because there were not so many women on the London streets at that time, it's why he described mainly men. Now, why did he write it? Well, the reason that most people give is that he felt that this was a discrete condition that nobody else had recognized as a species of disease. So he saw it as a new disorder that no eminent physicians anywhere in the world had actually recognized. He didn't think it was a new condition. It wasn't a new disease. It was just that it had never really been described in detail. So his first reason for writing it was that he felt nobody else had described it. Now, the next thing you can learn from James Parkinson's essay, it's only 60 pages long, it's a short essay, short monograph, is how to write an abstract. So if you are writing scientific papers, you will know that the first thing and the most memorable thing about a scientific paper is the abstract, and that's often the only thing that we remember. And yet many of the scientific papers that you read today are very difficult to understand. They're full of bad language, they're full of jargon. The authors are trying to make themselves more important by writing in a particular way that the majority of us can't understand. And James Parkinson was a master at writing very, very clearly so everybody could understand it, not just medical specialists. People, anybody could understand it. And this is his introduction to the essay. Involuntary tremulous motion with lessened muscular power, in parts not in action, and even when supported, with a propensity to bend the trunk forwards and to pass from a walking to a running pace. So in that 3 lines, he describes a resting tremor, a disturbance of movement, and a problem of posture and walking. And it's all in a very short, concise piece. So that's one lesson. Pay attention to your abstracts. Now, the real reason that he wrote the essay of the shaking palsy was that James Parkinson was not a famous, eminent doctor. He was what in England was called at that time a surgeon apothecary. These were equivalent to general practitioners or doctors who worked from their offices in the city. They saw all kinds of patients, but they were not allowed to prescribe medicines. Only physicians were allowed to prescribe medicines. So Parkinson wasn't even a physician. So you should never call him Dr. James Parkinson, because he wasn't a doctor. He was a surgeon apothecary. And he felt that all the great physicians in England at that time had missed this disorder. And the reason he wrote it is not that he wanted to just describe it as a clinical case history, but that he hoped that the anatomists of his day, the great anatomists, John Hunter, William Cullen, would examine patients when they died and find the cause for the shaking palsy. So that was his purpose of writing a monograph. And when you write a paper, you should always have a purpose. You should never write a paper with just the purpose of improving your personal impact factor and just doing it for that reason. You should have a real reason for doing it. And that was his reason for doing it. Now, he died in 1824, and it wasn't until 1999 that a Russian emigre from Saratov Konstantin Tretiakov, who emigrated to Paris with his family and worked with Pierre-Marie, started to look at the brains of people who died from Parkinson's disease. And Tretiakov was the first in this doctoral thesis to demonstrate the most important lesion in Parkinson's disease, which is severe loss of pars compacta nigral nerve cells. And this was what he described. Because he was a humble Russian émigré, and because the laboratory was regarded as a very second-class place in 19th century Paris, where the clinic ruled everything, nobody took any interest, or really, outside a few people in France. So the great pathologists like Hassler, the Vogt, Spielmeyer in Germany, nobody believed what Tretiakov had to say. So it wasn't until at least the late 1930s with Hassler and then with Greenfield that everybody began to accept that the substantia nigra was the cause of bradykinesia and rigidity in Parkinson's disease. So this is also an interesting story because, like Parkinson, Tretiakov only ever wrote one paper on Parkinson's disease. So some of my colleagues, and I've written a lot, have written hundreds of papers. Tretiakov wrote one paper. Parkinson wrote one paper. But these are the landmarks of our speciality. So you don't have to write 100 papers to be good at Parkinson's disease. You can just write one if it's got good science in it. And in that way, Parkinson and Tretiakov share similarities. Now, many people want to know why James Parkinson wrote the essay on the shaking palsy. As far as we know, none of his family had the shaking palsy, so there wasn't a familial reason for doing it. He was the sort of doctor or surgeon apothecary who liked to learn by writing. So he wrote many of his personal observations up in cases, not just about neurology, about gout, about appendicitis, anything that he found interesting, he wrote, and by writing, he learned. And so this is why I always encourage my residents to write case histories. Case histories have a very low impact factor, but they're actually a very good way of learning, because by writing a case report, you have to study the literature, you have to learn to write carefully. So I think this was one of the reasons he wrote. He'd seen some of these patients and he wanted to write them up. But there may have been subliminal influences. So when he was a medical student, or at least he was attending lectures as a young man, he attended the famous Scottish surgeon John Hunter's lectures in London at Leicester Square. And in one of Hunter's lectures, he describes a man called a lord whose hands were almost perpetually in motion, and he never felt the sensation in them being tired. And then again, in the later lectures, Hunter described a second patient who had universal palsy, and every part of the patient's body shook. So it may be that at the back of his mind, Parkinson remembered these lectures that he'd heard 20 years before he wrote an essay on the shaking palsy. So that may be one influence. Now, I entered neurology through natural history. As a young man, I was very interested in botany. And when I was 18, I wanted to go to the Amazon jungle and collect plants. But my mother and father very wisely told me that it would be difficult to make enough money being an ethnobotanist in the Amazon. So they directed me towards medicine. Now, so what use was botany? Well, botany, apart from materia medica and herbal plants and herbal medicines, is not much use now to medicine. But what it taught me was very careful observation. It taught me how to observe things very, very carefully. And equally importantly, it taught me how to record what I saw. And those two attributes were very, very useful for me when I started to do medicine. Why am I telling you about me? Because James Parkinson was a paleontologist and a geologist. So when he was alive, he was much better known as a paleontologist and a founder member of the Geological Society than he was for anything he did in medicine. And this is one of the fossils that he described, a genus of fossils, Parkinsonii, and he has several fossils named after him. Now, of course, there's a sort of metaphorical interest in this, and I don't know whether this will translate into Russian or Ukrainian, but in England, we sometimes call, very unkindly, old people fossils. So we refer to old people sometimes as fossils. And some of my patients with Parkinson's disease say to me, "Doctor, I've turned to stone." So Parkinson's has turned me to stone. And so this is an interesting link between Parkinson's interest in the ancient world and fossils and maybe his careful observation of patients with the shaking palsy in the street. So one or two of you, I know Tatiana and Irina, came to London for the Parkinson's celebrations, and this is this is a map of Parkinson's London. It's in the east, slightly to the east of the centre of the city, in what's called the City of London, close to where St. Paul's Cathedral is, where the big banks are. And James Parkinson lived all his life, almost all his life, here at 1 Hoxton Square. He was baptized and buried at this church, St. Leonard's Church. And when he retired, just before he died, he went to live in this place called 3 Pleasant Road. Now, if you read the biographies of Parkinson, it will often tell you that he lived in a countryside, a rural part of London, 5 miles from the center. But in fact, you can see from this map that already there was quite a lot of industrialization in London at that time, all these houses, so it was already getting quite busy. Now, this is a print taken from a prison close to where Parkinson lived, and the print is from 1811. And I'd like to try to convince you that this man in the prison has some of the body appearances of Parkinson's disease. He's flexed, looks as if he's taking little steps. So that might be a case of Parkinsonism in a work of art at the time Parkinson was practicing. I'll just show you a clip of Parkinson's London now, if we could play the video. So this is where Parkinson lived now. Well, not quite now, 12 years ago. So this is Hoxton Square, where his practice was. It's much the same. Whoops, sorry. Can you play it again? It's my fault, sorry. You'll see. So the square was probably quite similar to that when Parkinson lived there. But the houses, of course, have all been destroyed, and these are new houses. This is the number where he lived, but the house is different. So this is, and that was his house. And of course, now it's a very fancy restaurant. So where Parkinson lived is a fancy restaurant. And this is the square. You still see these are some of the fancy restaurants in the square. And this is the church, St. Leonard's Church, where he's buried and where he was baptized. And this is a plaque in memory of James Parkinson, which you can see inside the church. Now, if you Google Dr. James Parkinson, you'll see the first 10 pictures are all of this bearded man on the right. And if you look a little bit further down Google image, you'll see this other gentleman. Now, those of you who are interested in photography will know that the first photographs occurred in 1826, 1827. James Parkinson died in 1824. These pictures have been reproduced in many review articles. They're often shown at international symposium by speakers like me, purporting to represent James Parkinson. So these are what we call factoids. The one on the left is Dr. James Parkinson, who was a president of the British Dental Association in the end of the 19th century. This bearded pirate on the right, which is the much more commonly used one now, was James Cumin Parkinson, who has nothing to do with medicine. He was born in Belfast, and he emigrated to Australia in the gold rush, and he ended his life as a lighthouse keeper. So why am I showing you these, apart from to show you that these are fake news, as Donald Trump would say? But I'm also showing you them to warn you that, do we check our sources? Do we question things? If many of my eminent colleagues and your eminent colleagues are prepared to accept these as pictures of James Parkinson and publish them, what else? What other mistakes are being made? What else are they copying and not questioning? So, you know, this is not what James Parkinson's teaching you, it's more what I'm teaching you. But what I would say is you should question everything. My teachers always taught me to question everything they said. They would say to me, don't believe that, check it before you believe it. So you should question. If you want to be a good neurologist, you shouldn't accept anything, even if I'm saying it or Professor Farn is saying it. You know, question the validity of what you're saying. And that's what you can learn from these fake pictures. Now, this year we've been looking again to see if we can find paintings. It's surprising there is no painting of James Parkinson, because he was quite a famous paleontologist in his time, but there is no painting. But what Peter Brown and I, another colleague of mine, have discovered is this satirical print from 1796 by Samuel Collins. It's entitled The Oddfellows' Lodge, and the dinner is very close to where James Parkinson lived. The Oddfellows are, I don't know if you have these groups of individuals in Ukraine, but they're like the Masons, so they're liberal people who form groups together, brotherhoods, and James Parkinson was the surgeon of this particular lodge of Odd Fellows. So we are speculating that this little man, because the time is right, we know James Parkinson was the surgeon of this lodge in 1796, holding his prescription and his bottle of medicine, that might be a caricature of James Parkinson, but it's speculation. So don't all start reproducing this picture and saying it's James Parkinson. It's just a possibility. So to celebrate the bicentenary, the editors of the journal Brain asked me to write this article about James Parkinson and the essay in Brain. And at first I didn't know what to write because so much has been written about him. So I decided to focus on the single symptom and sign which is present in 100% of patients with Parkinson's disease, and that's bradykinesia. If you haven't got bradykinesia or akinesia, then you cannot be certain that you're dealing with Parkinson's disease. And bradykinesia is the only clinical sign for which we have good pathological correlation, loss of cells in the substantia nigra. So I decided to visit the essay, looking particularly at Parkinson's descriptions of the motor difficulties that patients had. His essay is better remembered for his descriptions of tremor and posture, but he also described difficulties with movement. So you'll see here, the legs are not raised to the height which the will directs, so that the utmost care is necessary to prevent frequent falls. And then he makes a point which Humboldt, in his autobiographical description of his own Parkinson's, makes, that many of the individuals he saw in the street didn't think that they had a disease. They just thought they were old, so that the aging process was misinterpreted when it should have been a disease state. It was just thought to be... this just describes a little bit about that, and it describes how he had difficulties writing or employing himself in any nicer kind of manipulation. So this is quite a specific description, and he must have spent time talking to the patients. And then the submission of the limbs to the directions of the will can hardly ever be obtained in the performance of the most ordinary offices of life. The fingers cannot be disposed of in the proposed directions. The dictates of the will, even in the late stages of the disease, are perverted. So this is, if you read this carefully, and of course for you it's not so easy, but he's clearly not describing paralysis. He's distinguishing the motor difficulties of Parkinson's from somebody who's had a cerebrovascular stroke, for example. The descriptions are really different. And I think he did quite well. I mean, it was not perfect, but the best description that there has ever been of the bradykinesia we have to give to Trousseau in his lectures from the Hotel Dieu, 60 years after Parkinson had died. So I'll just read this to you because it's a wonderful description of what happens with bradykinesia in Parkinson's. At first sight, the patient looks like a paralytic, but when on examining him carefully, it is soon apparent that there is only an apparent weakness. For if I ask the patient to squeeze Burke's dynamometer, the instrument marks 100 pounds, much more than it does when I squeeze it myself. Squeezed by the patient's healthy hand, it marks 84 pounds only. What takes place then? The muscles have retained their strength, and yet their functions are almost completely abolished. I asked this patient to open and shut his hand as rapidly as I could. He moved at first quickly, then more slowly, and after scarcely a quarter of a minute, he was unable to move at all. Just as a steam engine, which is insufficiently heated, is unable to work continuously, but if the valves be closed for a moment and the steam allowed to accumulate, the machine regains power for a time, but soon becomes powerless again. So it's almost like a myasthenic central weakness that Trousseau was describing so beautifully. In the case of our patients, it would seem as if they could only spend a determinate quantity of nervous influence, so there was a lack of cerebral vigor and motivation, a central fatigue underlying the motor difficulty of Parkinson's disease. So then we come on to Charcot. And Charcot had some difficulties getting a copy of the essay of the shaking palsy. But when he got a copy, he encouraged all his residents at the Salpêtrière Hospital to read it because it was an honest and it was a clinical description made by an honest and careful observer. And Charcot emphasized what Parkinson had described in his essay, that you could diagnose Parkinson's disease in the street, in the fully established condition. 4 of Parkinson's patients were examined only in the street. Only 2 did he examine in his rooms. So this is Charcot 60 years later saying that he has seen similar patients in Rome and Amsterdam. Charcot was a great traveler, one of the first neurological travelers. And they can be identified from afar. You do not need a medical history. So, as you all know, Parkinson's disease has the paradox that in the very early stages, it's very, very difficult to diagnose accurately. But in the late, fully established, untreated state, anybody can diagnose it. You don't need to be a neurologist. And Parkinson didn't like the term paralysis agitans or shaking palsy. So he decided to suggest that this condition, which he'd seen in his clinic at the Salpêtrière, should be called the maladie de Parkinson. He wanted to change the name for a number of reasons. One was that he had seen patients who didn't have a tremor, so he'd seen patients who he thought had Parkinsonism but had no rest tremor, and others, and also because he didn't think it was a paralysis, so he wanted to look for a better name than paralysis agitans. So he suggested maladie de Parkinson. Now, one thing that I cannot forgive James Parkinson for, and it shows that even good observers can miss things, is that Parkinson did not notice the characteristic facial appearance of people with Parkinson's. You have to remember that there was no physical examination at the time Parkinson was practicing. Physical examination came in the middle of the 19th century, but he should have been able to see this classical fixity of expression with lack of blinking and the permanent expression of anxiety and sadness, which Charcot described so beautifully in his Leçons du Mardi of 1888. So that's the only thing Parkinson really missed that you could criticize his description for. So these are some of the early videos. You remember cinematography began with the Lumiere brothers in the 19th century. Marinesco, who had been in Paris, returned to Bucharest. Van Gehoekten, a neurologist and anatomist at the University of Louvain in Belgium, were the earliest people to record on cinefilm what James Parkinson had described. So if we could show these 2 videos now. Just show the videos. That's it. This is a bit of a sort of gothic movie. I mean, you wouldn't be allowed to record 6 patients all together now, but you can see the characteristic body posture of Parkinson's in Marinesco's, and this is Van Gehoekten's. So this is these people look very like the descriptions of Charcot and Parkinson before him. And these were taken at the beginning of the 20th century, the first decade of the 20th century. And then this video, there's some sound to this.
For substantia nigra, there is difficulty in correcting posture when suddenly displaced. This man literally falls backwards when he is lightly pushed. In a healthy subject, rapid passive stretching of a muscle is a smooth movement. In the patient, the stretching is interrupted. and is called cogwheel. The volitional movements in the patient are definitely slower than those in the healthy subject. When the patient's hand is placed on his leg, a regular tremor develops in his fingers, thumb, and at the wrist. This tremor is likened to pill rolling. As he walks towards us,
So that's a video from my hospital before thalamotomy and before L-DOPA. So this is what patients used to look like, and in those days Parkinson's was a death sentence. You usually died after 9 or 10 years. So all of us living now are seeing a different kind of Parkinson's influenced by modern treatment compared with the sort that James Parkinson saw. So this is what I think is the sine qua non of the diagnosis of Parkinson's bradykinesia. So you have a slowness of initiation of voluntary movement with progressive reduction in speed and amplitude of repetitive actions. So the best way to test for this is that you ask the patient to make big, fast movements for 20 seconds. 15 seconds is too short, 30 seconds is too long. And you look for a progressive reduction in speed and amplitude. That's what bradykinesia is, and that's what Trousseau described, and what the modern motor neurophysiologists have confirmed as the cardinal features of bradykinesia. So why is bradykinesia important? Well, it's important because you can override it. You've all heard of kinesia paradoxica, so individuals who have been unable to walk with Parkinson's for many years, who in the face of a disaster, such as a fire or a shipwreck or an earthquake, can recover. And by rewarding patients...
You ready? Starting now.
You can overcome this. So this is a patient with Parkinson's disease who is doing a test called the carrot test. So he will be rewarded with money if he sorts out the cards in a correct way. So if you watch him, I think this is, now you can hear the money. So the more money he gets, the faster he moves. So he can temporarily overcome his bradykinesia by monetary reward. He's a man who likes money, so the reward has to be appropriate to the individual. But this shows us that it's possible to temporarily override the major motor handicap of Parkinson's disease. And that's why I think it's important for all of us in the field of Parkinson's not to focus on non-motor symptoms, but to focus on bradykinesia. Bradykinesia is the most important and disabling feature of Parkinson's disease. Of course, you can treat non-motor symptoms too, but this is not the most important thing. The most important thing is understanding why movement is impaired. And we wrote a second paper last year about James Parkinson's article, essay, and there are some other things I can tell you about it which I think you should learn. First of all, he described a syndrome for the first time. So he took Linnaeus's medical classification, medical taxonomy, where diseases were classified according to symptoms. And he was a heretic. He took two different diseases and made them into one. So that was pretty clever, and it was pretty courageous, and that's what he did. So although the term syndrome was not defined at that time, he created a syndrome. And one of the other things I think modern doctors can learn from James Parkinson's essay is modesty. If you read many modern papers, it's full of hype, it's full of self-publicity, it's full of exaggerating the findings. Parkinson wrote in a very measured, modest way. And I think that's how scientists should write, because we're never certain about things. But if you read many papers today, there's this over-altmetric exaggeration, which I think is to be deplored, really, and is not a good thing. So those are some things. Syndromes are discrete elements that belong together. So he had the idea that he could create a molecule out of two atoms, or he had the idea that you could make letters into words. That's what syndromes are. So they're a way of putting things together in a new way that is consistent. So you can describe Parkinson's disease really as a syndrome. Of course, it's a syndrome. We don't know the cause of it. And it's a collective manifestation or a pattern of clinical phenomena that's repeatedly observed, but not completely understood or explained. And there's been a tendency to degrade the importance of syndromes, and everything has become molecular pathology and biology to the expense of syndromes, when in fact I think syndromes are very constructive clinical ideas that work pari passu with science. So, these two things one should not exclude the other. The concept of a syndrome, and then we want to know what causes the syndrome, and the scientists can help us with that. So this is the other Parkinson. So I just want to show you this. So I think James Parkinson didn't describe this. So this is a disease which has the same neuropathology as Parkinson's disease, but it usually presents over the age of 65. All James Parkinson's patients were under 60 when they presented. It's more rapidly progressive. So this patient has only had the disease for 5 years. He's already in a wheelchair. He's got autonomic dysregulation. He has difficulties with word fluency and pentagon drawing. And his response to L-DOPA is present, but it's not excellent. It's modest. It's a modest response. And you can see he can ride a bicycle, but he can hardly walk, which is something you may know sometimes can happen in Parkinson's disease. So this is what has sometimes been called senile Parkinsonism or gait bulbar Parkinson's. And it can... the pathology is more or less exactly the same as you see with the younger patients, but the clinical picture is a bit different. And next one. Yeah. So if you look at brain bank work, what you see is that the terminal markers for Parkinson's disease, falls, visual hallucinations, which are a harbinger for dementia, and residential care, these all tend to occur in the early 70s in the large majority of patients. They don't occur in every patient. But these are the 4 things which kill people with Parkinson's disease. So these, the rest of it you can keep well controlled with L-DOPA and with deep brain stimulation. And then if you look at these, this was a paper we published in Brain, if you look at patients who presented at between the age of 24 and 53, and compare them with patients who presented at 73 to 80, the other Parkinson's disease that I've just shown you on the video, you'll see that it doesn't matter how long the duration of disease is, these terminal events all seem to occur around the same age. So it's almost as if there's a second process. Is it Alzheimer pathology? Is it amyloid? Is it something else which is dictating the death in patients? So Obviously, these patients, the window of opportunity for good treatment is much greater in patients who present young, because these terminal phases come in much later. So, of course, James Parkinson has been said to be the best-known neurologist in the world. You might argue it's Alzheimer's, but I suppose another thing we can learn from him is that you can become famous if you are lucky in Parkinson's or in medicine, and even though eponyms are less popular than they used to be, they're still present. I like eponyms, provided there are not too many of them. And of course, he was probably not the first person to describe this disease, but thanks to Charcot, he's the one whose name will be remembered. So what else can we learn from James Parkinson's essay? Well, one of James Parkinson's patients developed a hemiparesis between the visits when he saw him. And Parkinson wrote that during the time that this patient had a motor hemiparesis, it was probably a lacunar stroke, because he recovered a fortnight later. The tremor completely disappeared. So the stroke had produced a kind of thalamotomy. And if you read the early literature on surgery for Parkinson's disease, thalamotomy, pallidotomy, and so on, many of the surgeons acknowledge the influence and inspiration of James Parkinson's case report of this patient who'd had a stroke and lost the tremor, in encouraging them to explore surgical approaches. So that's maybe another little lesson that you can learn from it. And of course, you can learn the lesson that case reports can be very important. I mean, case reports, many journals who are preoccupied with their impact will not accept clinical case reports. But in fact, the internet has made the humble clinical case report much more powerful now than it was 20 or 30 years ago, because we have we have an acquisition of database, so that you can scour the internet for clinical case reports and put them together. So I think the clinical case report should be encouraged. It's not something which is outdated, and it can still be extremely helpful and informative in neurology. Now, I've told you already that the neurological examination the physical examination did not really begin until the early part of the 19th century. And Charcot and Parkinson, of course, were emphasizing something that we like a lot in neurology, and that is the fact that because neurology is a visual art, you can sometimes diagnose patients immediately they come in to the consulting room. So one component of neurology, which we all like because it can show us to be very clever, is the spot diagnosis, field work, spot diagnosis. So the physical examination is something quite different, and really in neurology only was perfected towards the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. This is a painting from Aranda, a Spanish Sevillano painter from Spain, showing a physician doing his ward round and listening for chest noises. And you will see this is the ward. And I like this painting very much because it reminds me of my own ward rounds in my hospital when I was training. Because if you look at this man, it looks like he's looking at his mobile phone. Of course, there was no mobile phones at that time, but if you look at him, he's doing something. He's not paying attention. And all of you who have done ward rounds will know that there are the attentive, keen students here watching. And then this one is probably looking at a nice, pretty nurse at the other end of the corridor. So you know, it's a nice picture of but it reminds us that of the importance of the ward round, at least in my training, Now, what is a worrying thing is that this is the new bedside now, especially in the United States. This is the ward round. Where is the patient? Maybe somewhere behind the screen, I don't know. And this has also raised interesting issues about whether the ward round is still appropriate, and even worse, is the physical examination still important? And Abraham Verghese, who some of you may know, an American physician who is fighting to revive or reanimate the physical examination in America, has coined this term, the eye patient. So the eye patient, US residents in neurology, they spend 50% of their time on the computer and only 9% interacting with patients. I mean, we spent 80% of our time interacting with patients and 20% maybe in the library or in teaching rounds. And this has come to, this is all to do with what's called instant neurological diagnosis. Some of you may have been to the American Academy of Neurology, where they have this very popular thing called a Neuro Bowl. It's like a quiz, and it's all to do with spot diagnosis. It's all to do with things like House. I don't know if you have House in Ukraine, but it's an American film about a neurologist who makes remarkable instant diagnoses from just looking at people, and often gets it wrong, actually. So this book has come out, and it's quite a nice book, but I think that this is only part of the business of neurology. We all like to do a little bit of showmanship, and sometimes it is possible to make very clever, quick diagnoses. But this is a trend which is quite scary. This is one of my colleagues at Queen Square who says he's stopped examining patients in outpatients. He's so clever and he has so many years of experience that he doesn't need to examine patients anymore. At least that's what he's written in this article. Well, I'm not as clever as Dr. Hawkes, so I still need to examine patients. And I'll tell you why I need to still examine patients. First of all, it gives me time to think. When you're taking the history, you're thinking, but sometimes you need a bit more time to think. And the examination allows you to think. It also allows you to look at certain things, which it's difficult to look at when you're taking the history. For example, the patient has their clothes on, of course, when you're taking the history, but there are other things that the examination allows you to look at. And an MRI scan doesn't allow you to look at the patient. So those are two reasons. And then, of course, there's the economic reasons for doing it, that examining or ordering an MRI scan on every single patient is a very wasteful, profligate type of medicine, and not a very interesting one. I'm most interested in the neurology where the MRI scan is normal, to be honest with you. I mean, I find that much more interesting and intriguing. And then, of course, sometimes the examination gives you the particular diagnosis, which you wouldn't get in any other way. And training, I mean, medical students need to learn what is normal and abnormal in order to say what's pathological. And you can only do that by examining and examining and examining. Sometimes you do the examination to impress your patient as well as the student. So many patients I see complain that the physicians that they have seen before me have never examined them or even taken their clothes off. And so they don't think very much of those physicians. They expect to be examined. They might not expect to have all their clothes taken off, but they expect at least a physical examination. And the ritual, we're all ritualistic. So we get married, we have funerals, And the ritual of the physical examination, the laying on of hands, is transformational for patients. It's a transformational ritual. So it's like a massive placebo, if you like. You know, it really helps the patient to get better. So even if you have an MRI scan and you know what the diagnosis is, I would still examine the patient. Even, you know, I still think it's worth doing. So this is a plug for the examination. And it's not just in the United States where this is a problem. So this is a colleague of mine in Birmingham who was referred in a general hospital. He was referred 407 patients to see for a neurological opinion. And what he found was that 36% of them, nobody had used a tendon hammer. These were patients with neurological symptoms. 70% an ophthalmoscope had not been used, and 22% couldn't recall a stethoscope. This was in the United Kingdom. So one of the myths that the neuroradiologists like to tell us is that most diagnoses are made by imaging, but this is not true. If you look at the evidence, you will see that most diagnoses are not made by MRI scan. Most diagnoses are made by a combination of history and examination. Labs and imaging contributes about a third. So it's incorrect to say that the final diagnosis is usually made by tech. It's not. It's also incorrect to say that there is no evidence base for physical examination. There is a massive evidence base for the physical examination. So what you do, if you do it properly, there is a lot of evidence for that. Some of it's in books like this, from the Rational Clinical Examination, evidence-based physical diagnosis, and so on. So there is a large evidence base for the physical exam. And this is, again, from Verghese in the States, showing 208 clinical vignettes where problems with physical examination, mainly not doing it, had contributed to error. So in 63% of these patients who were misdiagnosed, no physical examination had been done. What were the consequences of not doing a physical examination? Quite considerable. Delayed diagnosis or no diagnosis, incorrect diagnosis, unnecessary treatment, no or delayed treatment, and of course, a lot of unnecessary cost. Now, this is just I've already told you that I don't like textbooks very much. I only use textbooks as a reference source, so that if I see a disease in the hospital that I don't know much about, then I might look up some details about it in a textbook, but I never read a textbook like the Bible or anything else. So this is one of the most authoritative books on child and adolescent psychiatry by one of my colleagues, Sir Michael Rutter, at the Maudsley Hospital. It's the go-to book. It's like Adams and Victor or Brain's Textbook of Neurology for psychiatrists. And it's had all these editions. Rutter is still alive, so it's now in its 5th edition. So what I noticed when I read it, well, this is just to remind you, William Osler, to study the phenomenon of disease without books is to sail an uncharted sea, while to study books without patients is not to go to sea at all. So back to the Rutter book that I was just telling you about. So these are I've looked at all these books. So each edition has these number of pages. So if you look at all the editions, there's 5,000 pages. From 1977 to 2008. And within this book, there are 4,500 references to Rutter. the first author. 4,500 references. This is just one page, just to show you what I discovered. So every time I saw the word rutter, I put a circle around it. This is Sherlock Holmes' work, you know, looking at this. So 960 pages, 58 chapters, rutterosis, a disease of rutterosis, rutter, the author. And you know what? Not a single child, not one child in this textbook. This is the go-to book for child psychiatry. There is no mention of a child. There's no vignettes, there's no case histories, not one child in a child psychiatry book. So this textbook is assuming that the people who read it know everything about children already. I mean, how to deal with difficult children. So, and you know, I'm not singling out Rutter for particular attention. If you look at some of the other neurological monographs, you'll find very similar, full of references to the author, you know? So, this is also you can learn from Parkinson. I'm finishing now. So, we're all, our students and registrars are encouraged to think analytically, and that's good. And, you know, you talk about slow thinking. Sherlock Holmes is a slow, deductive thinker who puts all the evidence together, observes very carefully, questions everything, and on the balance of probabilities comes to a diagnosis. But what we're forgetting, and the physical examination is very important for this, is that we're forgetting to teach the skill of information gathering, so that our students are not, they might know everything, and they might know from Google everything, but they don't know how to collect data. They don't know how to collect information. So they're losing the skill of collecting the basic data, which for most of us allows us to come to the clinical diagnosis. So that, I think medical education really needs to focus on not just analytical thinking, which is important, but information gathering. So this is my last slide. It's taken from Francis Bacon, but I've converted it to neurology. So the men of experiment are like an ant. They only collect and use. So these are the scientists. So the scientists are the ants. And this is very honorable, very reputable work. And we all depend on science to help us to understand disease mechanisms. And then what used to be the philosophers, but are now the cognitive scientists, are the reasoners resemble spiders. So the scientists are the ants, the philosophers and the cognitive scientists are the spiders who make cobwebs out of their own substance. But all of us here, most of us here, are neurologists, and we are the bees. We are the bees, because what we do is we gather material, we collect data from flowers, and we transform and digest it by a power of its own. And this is the business of neurology, so that we take the pollen from all the different flowers, from the psychologists, from the scientists, the imagers, and it's our job to put it all together. And that's what the bees do. They pick the best, and then they make honey, and the honey is the diagnosis. So we are the bees, and that's really something that I think James Parkinson helps us to understand, because he was a careful noticer. He observed carefully, he critically analyzed the data, he questioned what was known, and he created a new syndrome. And he didn't get much recognition during his lifetime, although subsequently it was recognized that it was a clear account of a disease. But that's what I think neurology should be. And I think, if I can finish with a bit of propaganda, I think it's all your responsibility to make neurology more romantic. Neurology is serious, very serious. We deal with the most horrible, unpleasant diseases in medicine, many of them. But neurology should also be fun. It should be stimulating, it should be fascinating, and even romantic. So if all you do is read guidelines and follow algorithms and Google, personally, I don't find that very romantic or exciting. So I'm encouraging you to talk to your patients, listen to narrative, use your brain. This is what's the fun about neurology. And this is why we're like James Parkinson and why we're like Sherlock Holmes a little bit. Thanks very much.